Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the sixth session of the Climate Change Displacement Dialogue Series. This series is presented in partnership with the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, York Emergency Mitigation, Engagement, Response, and Governance Institute, CFAL Philippines, the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, and Antalya Bilam University. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Yvonne Su. Dr. Yvonne Su is the director of the Center for Refugee Studies. Her research is on forced migration, climate change-induced displacement, and queer migration. She has worked extensively with vulnerable communities in Southeast Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean, including refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, Indigenous peoples, and LGBTQ+ communities. Her work has been cited by the international organizations like the IPCC and IOM. Dr. Su has garnered over $8 million in research funding, including funding from NFRF and SSHRC. She takes an interdisciplinary, participatory, and decolonial approach to scholarship that is focused on developing strong partnerships with local communities, NGOs, and policymakers. Dr. Su, thank you very much for moderating today's session and for all of your help with putting this series together. The floor is yours.
Okay. Sorry, Francesco. I thought you were going to introduce Dr. Hein de Haas.
Oh, I'm happy to introduce.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. I can. Sorry.
Okay.
A little miscommunication, and I can of course make mine a little personal too, because Hein and I are friends. So, and many of you already know him here. I think that's why you've come, because you've read about his book, his amazing book, which I have here, How Migration Really Works. I have all copies of it. I've got the original hard copy, the pocket book, the audio book, and I believe there are 14 different translations floating around. Your latest one being the Turkish one. So Dr. De Haas is well known as a sociologist and a geographer. He's lived and worked in Netherlands, Morocco, and United Kingdom. He is so kind to join us from field work in Senegal right now. He's currently a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and between 2006 and 2015, he was the founding member and co-director of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford, and it's continuing now at the University of Amsterdam. He is also a professor of migration and development at the University of Maastricht. I won't go into all his work because there's so much, but he is just a great scholar, absolutely inspirational. Inspirational for me when I went to Oxford and I met him. And I actually, through reading the book, found out that he was responsible for the fourth part of the Foresight report that came out the same year that I started my master's to look at climate refugees. And you'll know from this talk, which is going to happen, that the report came out and said that climate refugees do not exist. And Dr. De Haas was a part of that report. And when I found that out, I had to change the direction of my research. And in a way, it's also come back to this topic. So we'll have a really interesting discussion. And please, Hein, take it away and tell us what you think about climate migration.
Thanks. Thanks for this very kind and humbling introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'm right now in Senegal, doing focus groups with potential migrants, young people, older people. Very interesting. Saint Louis, this is a fisher community basically, and people go with these long boats to the Canary Islands these days, and so I'm discovering a lot of new things. We had about 8 hours of interviews. Nobody was mentioning climate change, by the way. All sorts of other reasons they were leaving. But it doesn't, of course, mean that climate change is irrelevant, and that's the last thing I would like to say today. But of course, I want to put a lot of nuance to the argument. I'm not sure. I mean, you're all specialized in the topics. I don't think I have to go through the basic movements of what I've already written on the topic. I try to go in depth as quickly as possible, also relating to my own fieldwork experiences. And in a way, what is interesting is that I'm kind of coming full circle as a researcher, because I was trained as an environmental geographer. So I'm one of the last real geographers, I always say. I had a big part of my education was in physical geography and social geography. More and more geography has become separate, and that I think is very sad in a way, because the real things that sets geography apart from any other science, I think, is its combining of the sort of biophysical and the social. And I did a sort of special track when I was a student, which was called Environmental Geography of the Tropics and Subtropics. And this is why I head off to Morocco originally, because of most of my primary field work for both my master's and my PhD was in Morocco and other North African countries. And actually went to Morocco originally to study the reasons why traditional oasis agriculture in the sort of dryland areas in Morocco was in a crisis. And I was looking at issues of desertification and social change. And it was only through doing my field work that I discovered migration as an important factor of change. So I got sucked into migration studies through this actually doing research on environmental issues and agriculture in the deep south of Morocco. And I've been away from the topic for many years, but in recent years, of course, because the issue of climate change and migration, starting actually the Foresight report, but I think the narrative has only gained force since then. I'm coming full circle and coming back to those issues actually started with in my own research career. And I cannot hide the fact that I'm sometimes quite irritated and annoyed that the basic lesson of Geography 101 is get rid of determinist views about human society and the environment, because the classic geographers of the late 19th century, they made these theories about societies being a product almost of the environment of people. And of course, it's the basic thing you learn as a geographer, to stray away from those determinist views. And almost completely logically, you'd already intuitively feel as a geographer that to make any direct link between climate change or environmental change more generally and social change is a very, very risky proposition, because it is non-determinist, basically. Some geographers say there's a probabilistic range of social responses to things happening in the biophysical environment, but nothing is preset. And to me, this shouldn't be an issue. But when I read newspapers, I'm not talking to you here, but it's really the more general field, I'm actually quite shocked. And I think part of the problem is that many pundits, journalists, but also many climate scientists have no expertise on migration. They're still stuck in the push-pull model. I'm not going to elaborate on that one, which I think is a pseudo theory, pure and dure. It has nothing to do with the science of migration, but that is still applied blindly to migration by people who have no clue about how migration really works. So I think that is sort of a lot of my energy and anger on the issue comes from there.
Dropping your book title as often as you can, eh, Hein?
Well, it just happened. But I think, yeah, migration is a science. And that's one of the things I try to also advocate in my book. We migration researchers have to be much more proud about what we know. We talk about a century of migration scholarships. We've become very good at stating what we don't know as part of the postmodern condition. I think it's a very healthy basic attitude, but unfortunately we have not be as good to state what we kind of know. And I think we need to come into the debate much more forcefully as migration researchers. So I think progress has definitely been made in the field, so I don't want to disacknowledge that. But I want to make explicit on what sort of theoretical foundation I'm going to give the rest of my talk today. And that is really the field of what's also called political ecology. And that's also the field I've been trained into. And that's a field of social science research that came up in the 1980s as an interdisciplinary field whose guiding objective is to understand the complex relations between environment and society through analyzing the forms of access and control over resources. And of course, that immediately brings into the debate issues of inequality and power. we cannot have a simplistic discussion about a one-to-one relation between the environment without bringing in those bigger questions. So it's a political economic analysis that needs to be had. Now, and of course, that perspective also questions the whole analytical separation of society and environment and emphasizes the sort of reciprocal functional interactions between population and environmental change. And it very much also emphasizes the social and political construction of the environment and even nature. And on this basis, I will criticize the climate refugee narratives. And just let me leave no misunderstanding also, because it's going to be recorded and put on YouTube. Without any doubt, global warming is one of the most pressing issues facing humanity. And the lack of willingness of the international community to address this is a huge source of major public concern and global protest. However, to link this issue with the specter of mass migration is a dangerous practice based on myth rather than fact. And as I've argued in earlier writings, the use of apocalyptic migration forecasts to support the case for urgent action on climate change is not only intellectually dishonest, but also puts the credit of those using this argument, as well as the broader case for climate change action, seriously at risk. But this is not the main point of my talk today, which is a more fundamental issue, and that is an attack on the very concept of climate migration or climate refugees. So I take issue with the very terms of climate migration, climate displacement, or climate refugees because of its determinism and monocausal assumptions. Second, the lack of empirical basis. And third, it's based on a fundamentally flawed and frankly misleading understanding of the very nature and causes of migration. I really believe it is as nonsensical to talk about climatic refugees or climate refugees as it would be to talk about, for instance, demographic refugees. Now, let me briefly run through my main argument first. So the point is not to say that climate change can play some role in human mobility, whether this is normal climatic variations in the form of Kondrachev-like cyclical variations in weather patterns, as well as long-term real climate change, but that the role of climate factors is highly indirect and mediated by many different factors. And in that sense, it's actually impossible to attribute migration directly to climate, because it would depoliticize the whole issue, apart from the fact that migration is, of course, multi-causal. Now, about the multi-causality, we know, of course, that the biophysical environment in which people live, whether this is in urban or rural environments, and the resources they could access through it, is only one of the many factors playing a decision in shaping people's aspirations and capabilities to migrate. But in case of climate, the indirectness is double. It has a second layer, as also people's biophysical environment is shaped by many factors, of which climate is only one of the many, and agency of groups of people, corporations, and governments is another important one in shaping our biophysical environment. So we have a huge attribution problem. And I would like to say, will the first climate migrants please stand up? And it's very difficult once you look at practical examples. Here in Saint Louis in Senegal, young fishermen don't talk about climate change. They talk about oil drilling taking place off the coast because oil wells have been discovered, precluding fishers from going there. So yeah, there is a real change in people's environments, but that is actually caused by something political and economic. When I was in ZY in rural Ethiopia, massive land grabbing was happening and preventing pastoralists from using ancestral grazing lands. In southern Morocco, and I talk about this case a bit later from my own research, rich farmers are depleting underground water resources, depriving small oasis peasants of access to underground water resources. In many cases, it's very difficult to know what is the real cause of a flood. Think about the lack of maintenance of dikes and levees that lead to increasing flooding risks. Is it the environment, or is it actually politics or inequality? And this makes it empirically not only impossible, but also I think conceptually quite nonsensical to attribute migration to climatic factors directly. And from a political economy and from a political ecology perspective, the real question is really about inequality and power. So the climate refugee narrative peddled by media, experts, and politicians is not only damaging by grossly exaggerating the size of displacement, but actually adds to right-wing narratives about massive invasions happening, but crucially also distracts attention away from the political causes of displacement. Though displacement is a huge issue, the linkage directly to environment and climate is an empirically questionable but also conceptually dangerous proposition. For instance, it's well established, and I elaborate on that also in my book chapter on climate change and migration. It is very well established that the main cause of increased flooding in many coastal areas is not so much sea level rise, but man-made land subsidence and erosion. Similarly, desertification is not about advancing deserts, but about local phenomenon of land degradation caused by land and water mismanagement or less extensive agriculture. Actually, satellite imagery shows that the Sahel zone, so the sort of semi-dry area in sub-Saharan Africa, has grown greener rather than drier. Real problems with environmental scarcity have to do with local social and political changes and crisis of management of natural resources. And here I'd like to give my own example of my own ongoing research, because I've never stopped doing research in Moroccan oases, how migration is linked to the crisis in oasis agriculture and phenomenon we also know as desertification. If you would go to southern Morocco and many other oasis areas in the south of Algeria or Tunisia, you would see an image of sand dunes, abandoned lands, dead palm trees, the specter of dying oases. And the dominant narrative has been for decades already, whether you look in the media, politics, but also by many researchers, that in the past they would mention drought. These days, the tagline is climate change, and a lack of water is causing the decline of traditional oasis agriculture and responsible for the so-called rural exodus towards cities, but also abroad. And that's what we're right now seeing on the Mediterranean with illegal migration and smuggling is a direct consequence of climatic change and environmental degradation. However, in reality, things are way more complex. And the relation between migration and environment is there, but actually the other way around relationship in this particular case seems to be much more important. First of all, oases are highly anthropogenetic agricultural systems, totally man-made agricultural systems based on irrigation agriculture. Now, from the early 20th century, migration started to take off during the time of French colonization to cities, but also to France and later to other European countries. And it's put in motion a whole chain of social and economic changes that first made people less dependent on agriculture, but also contributed to the breakdown of traditional institutions for collective land and water management, and also encouraged individuals who had the money to break out of the collective agricultural system and to start private farms in the desert and start to pump water. And this overpumping has contributed to the decrease of the lowering of traditional water tables and had it made more difficult for relatively poor peasants who didn't have access to money, either for migration or other resources, to dig deeper wells and pump more water, actually drove them out of business. So yes, migration has been a major factor in making people less motivated to work in agriculture, to abandon their field, or to engage into agricultural practices, and particularly mechanized water pumping, that have undermined the basis under traditional oasis agriculture. But these have been changes that have clearly created an environment and crisis in the biophysical environment of oasis agriculture, like the images had a specter of dying oasis that I sketched in the beginning. But in this particular case, the relation is rather the other way around, that migration has actually the main trigger, or one of the main triggers, that has caused a crisis in traditional oasis agriculture. In a way, people have been withdrawing from agriculture, which has allowed the desert to take its old place rather than the desert has been advancing. Now, of course, this is just one example, and I don't want to say this is representative for all cases of environmental displacement, but what it does show, it illustrates the complexity and reciprocal nature of the linkages between human mobility and environment. And I think the huge risk of abuse of the climate change narrative to dismiss governments for their responsibility to address real problems that may exist. For instance, unequal access to water in this case, but think about the reverse case of places that risk flooding, of who's going to be protected from floods and who is not going to be protected from flooding, or who is responsible for the management of water and landed resources. But apart from that, the assumption that environmental and climatic relation stresses will lead to significant migration is flawed for 10 different reasons. And I'm going to list them here briefly. First of all, we know from, I think, a century of migration research that the most striking feature about migration is that most people don't move. People have a very strong home bias. And this is the main reason why evidence shows that most displacement in response to environmental stresses, such as floods, droughts, hurricanes, and non-climate change related events like, for instance, earthquakes, is short distance and temporary. Your home basis is huge. I mean, I was struck by the sad images of what's happening in Gaza, that despite everything that happens, most people still want to go back home, and people will do everything to make that work. Second, and this is more fundamental in the political ecology world, is that so-called population pressure. This word is used a lot. I think it's a questionable concept, but this is the idea of you have more people than the natural environment can in a way provide for, has historically been the reason to innovate. Esther Boserup, a Danish economist, already wrote this book in the 1960s, that she actually tracked also historically that whenever there is population growth with limited resources, the default response of human beings has been to intensify agriculture, to develop new agricultural techniques like irrigation or terracing, new cropping patterns, introducing new crops to make agriculture more productive. So that testifies to human agency and the huge resilience of humans to cope with environmental adversity. Third, the irony is that actually if you look at the big migration patterns historically, that most people actually migrate towards environmentally vulnerable areas. Because the paradox is that the most vulnerable areas environmentally, if you think, for instance, about flooding, also happen to be the most fertile ones. I think about floodplains, coastal areas, delta areas. And as I cite a farmer that was interviewed by one of my students in Mozambique in the Limpopo Valley, summarized it so succinctly: the good land is there where the floods are. And if we look at population and population density, according to the push-pull model, we would expect that people would move from densely populated areas to sparsely populated areas. The paradox again is that most migration is actually happening from sparsely populated to densely populated, highly degraded areas that are often prone to flooding, for instance. And this, of course, upsets the entire push-pull model and the entire neo-Malthusian, I would say, sloppy thinking about the relation between population, environment, and migration. Fifth, in practice, historically speaking, the pressure to adapt to environmental pressures have often pushed communities and societies to innovate, to turn this into an advantage. I already mentioned irrigation. Quite an old theory by Carl Wittfogel, the hydraulic state, has argued it is not a coincidence that many of the first sort of bigger states, or what we would call in the past civilizations, were actually created in areas where collective organization of water management was necessary. I'm talking about irrigated agriculture, for instance, in the Nile Valley or in Mesopotamia, but also many other early civilizations found their origins in the need almost to have a collective way of organizing yourself to get access to water. But I'm from the Netherlands, and that's a reverse case. The Dutch, half of the Netherlands is under the seawater, and historically the Dutch have always waged a war against the threat of the sea, and that very early on forced the Dutch to collaborate, techniques to not only defend farmers against the water, but also reclaim actually more land from the water. So it doesn't mean again that this is the automatic reaction, but we should be very aware of the pitfalls of neo-Malthusian thinking where we think that either scarcity, in this case of water, or the threat of water will necessarily lead to the downfall of societies and mass immigration, or indeed to water wars. In many cases, we see that scarcity often encourages people to collaborate. Again, this is not automatic, but it is certainly one of the possible outcomes. So we need to be very, very careful not to fall into those sort of deterministic assumptions. The sixth reason why we cannot just assume that environmental pressures will lead to more migration is this assumption that rural livelihoods are entirely dependent on agriculture. More and more, if you look around in the world, we should stop crunching rural livelihoods into subsistent agriculture type of livelihoods, because livelihoods are diversifying all around the world. And in fact, this is one of the main strategies people have used to become less vulnerable on only one source of income. And it brings me to the seventh point, that migration, interestingly enough, actually often plays a big role in the latter. We know that many people actually leave in order to stay. A very old study that was done in Morocco back in 1977 about the reasons why people left rural areas in Morocco to Europe was, how they would say it in French, partir pour rester. It's very difficult to translate the sense directly into English, but as some of you are Canadian, you will understand this, but it means you leave in order to stay. And again, having done interviews here in Saint Louis, here in Senegal, everybody talks about, I want to go away in order to invest back, building a house, starting an enterprise, starting a family, educating my kids. So ironically, leaving is often part of multi-local livelihood strategies to, in a way, secure your place back home and make yourself less vulnerable, including to environmental stresses. Well, the eighth reason is that most vulnerable populations lack the resources to move over long distances. And this exposes the fundamental flaws of this push-pull model, because migration requires resources. But not only that, migration is a resource. It's rather an investment in a better future of entire families, rather than this stereotypical flight, desperate flight from misery. So climate change is real, but advances in migration theory reveal that there are as many reasons to believe that global warming will lead to less as to more migration. So again, it's a very ambiguous relationship. I thought I had 10 points, but I think I only have 9 ones. So I arrive at the 9th and the last one.
No, that's fine. And I think if you can make your final points, I've got some questions to ask you. And I think the audience.
No, I'm not done yet. I was about to make my last point, which was my 9th point. And then I think I stick to the 30 minutes. I started a bit too late.
Okay.
So in fact, the most vulnerable people, of course, are likely to get trapped in life-threatening situations, as impoverishment will actually deprive them from the means to use migration to make themselves more resilient. And this is, and I said this in my book and elsewhere, the genuine concern about the change should focus on those who are stuck in situations that Jürgen Carling already called 20 years ago involuntary immobility, those who are trapped, who are unable to use migration as a way to increase their resilience. But apart from those empirical points I was mentioning, I really think it is problematic to keep on talking about climate displacement, about climate refugees. I don't think language is innocent. It is like if we keep on using push and pull terminology, we subscribe to a worldview in which people have no agency, because the very metaphors of push and pull already evoke this idea of passivity. People are being pushed and pulled around by macro forces. So I really think it is high time in the discussions about migration to get rid of such simplistic models, simplistic concepts that actually are more an obstruct our ability to really understand the subtleties in the relation between climate, environment, and mobility, and particularly it depoliticizes the whole discussion. So these were just some remarks. I kept within the 30 minutes. I deliberately, and I talked about this with the organizers, I really would like to have as much time as possible to have interaction and time for questions and responses. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hein. So I have 2 questions for you, and the question actually relates to your very last point. And of course, your book is known for having really good zingers. So I think the one you're very famous for is immigrants don't steal jobs. They fill vacancies, right? And another one you have in this chapter particularly is governments, not the climate, displace people, right? And that's kind of a lot of your argument. But the question I want to pose to you is that, is climate change not similarly a political issue as the other issues that you've talked about, right? Land grabbing, inequality, capitalism. So what is lost when we don't view climate change as political, right? What is the cost of not talking about climate migration if we view climate change as political?
Great question. Yeah, of course, climate change is political on the global level, and the sort of lack of action, collective global action is, I think I said this in the beginning, is of course totally a political issue. This is more about responsibility. This is about, I think, my reply will be, you're right, but this is about levels of analysis and also levels of responsibility. Because what I see in practice, I've seen this in Morocco a lot, that government basically say, well, we can't do much about it because we have this crisis because of climate change, which in a way dismisses the government from its own responsibility, for instance, to regulate water pumping. Very, very straightforward issue. That water power is getting concentrated in the hands of a few farmers who dominate cash cropping of watermelons, for instance, for export purposes, which means that smaller peasants don't have access to underground water. So I think it's all political. Climate change is political, but also the impacts of climate change are political, of course. But it is also political issues when governments start to, I would say, abuse the climate change argument to not take action where they clearly have responsibilities and actually have the abilities to intervene. And this is all about inequality. I mean, that's where it comes down to. So this will be my thanks for the question, because it helped me to clarify that, yeah, of course, on a global level, climate change is totally political. But
and it's all intertwined too, because you go on further to talk about how development-induced displacement and now climate change mitigation are also displacing people. And some of my new work is looking at climate change adaptation projects, which are funded in the name of climate change, and then used to displace people, and also a form of disaster capitalism. So I think it's all very intertwined, and you do a good job of teasing it apart. My other question for you is, how does the concept of habitability engage with your discussion of people moving into environmentally dangerous areas or land that is increasing, such as the atolls in Tuvalu, right? Because none of these places may be habitable. Just like you're talking about the erosion and the sand, the deposits of soil and the geography aspect of it, which is again very helpful. And I think a lot of people who might not have the physical geography knowledge would not have included that in their work. So this speaks to your past. So what are your thoughts on the habitability aspect? And should we also be careful regarding thinking that the historical growth of land that you're describing, because a lot of your data is historical, that we've seen in the past, that it will continue into the future? When we know that climate change is increasing the intensity and severity of environmental change and disasters in some parts of the world. So say in the Pacific, we're known that the king tides and some of the disasters that will take place are going to be more severe.
What do you mean exactly by habitability?
So I just mean their ability to live there, right? You've made some really good points about how people really want to, and there's a strong resilience to live in more environmentally dangerous areas. But how do we engage with that, knowing that it's so risky to live there? It may be increasingly risky to live there.
I mean, first of all, I mean, talking about low-lying areas, so coastal areas or river valleys prone to flooding, of course, a lot can be done to make people less vulnerable to such risks. So water engineering, we cannot do a lot actually, but of course there may be instances where, I mean, I also wrote about, for instance, coastal environments are highly dynamic. So even without climate change, you see that some islands disappear, other pop up. This is what always is happening in coastal areas. Here in the Senegal River in Saint Louis, the Senegal River meets the Atlantic basically, and the location of breaches and things and dunes is constantly changing. I'm from the Netherlands, so these things are constantly dynamic. Villages may disappear on the west side of of an island, and new land may appear on the eastern end of an island. But it doesn't mean there's no problem. I mean, the weakest will probably draw the shortest stick of any of those developments. And any powerful actor, like somebody who wants to develop a new tourist area or a new industrial area or whatever, will of course more easily get access to that land. And people who will lose the land, let's say on the other side of the island, will probably, in situations of high inequality and authoritarianism, because democracy is key here, I think, that people also have the leverage to in a way, political leverage to ask if they're on the short end of the stick, whether it's human-induced or non-human induced environmental change, that they can have an alternative in terms of where to live. So this is not to deny that these things happen. It is more about, again, providing alternatives. And this is really a question of inequality and having access to, because I was shocked when I read about the Maldives, for instance, how the Maldives government is somehow abusing the sea level rise argument to basically dislocate people from the islands where they want to keep on living. And the hidden agenda seems to be that they want to convert those islands into tourist resorts. And I think that actually shows how tricky it is to buy too easily into sort of these macro narratives that actually may glance over all of these power things. That doesn't mean, of course, that the habitability is not an issue. Think about
but
heat.
It's good you brought up the Maldives, because the other thing I think people don't talk about, and I thought you were going to mention in the book, was that huge artificial island that got built right beside the capital.
Yeah.
Right, because they wanted to sell off the outer islands as opposed to having people live there. They thought, okay, we're just going to make an artificial island right next to the capital because it's close to the airport.
Yeah, I said Schiphol Airport and the Amsterdam Airport is 6 meters under the sea level. So if governments really want something, if there's big interest, they can make it happen. And then people can say, well, the Netherlands is a rich country, but it wasn't 500, 600, 700 years ago when those techniques were being developed out of sheer necessity against the common struggle against the sea. Now, what will happen in the future? You're right. I mean, so far, research based on satellite imagery analysis shows that most deltas haven't decreased in size. Many actually have increased in size. Bangladesh hasn't had a net loss of land mass, but a net gain. Of course, there's not any guarantee for the future. So I want to make this very clear, but it is very clear that most cases of increased flooding in many Asian coastal cities has been through land subsidence and through the too much water pumping has caused the land to sink actually much faster than the sea is rising. So sea level rise does play some role, but it's not the primary reason for increasing flooding risk. So again, this is totally political, obviously, if you think about it. During a flood, governments have to take decisions which neighborhoods to flood to get rid of the excess water. This is, of course, a completely political decision, and you can already guess what neighborhood will be flooded and which not. And heat is another thing. I mean, I've lived in southern Morocco for quite many years, and it's interesting. We can also learn from traditional ways of building, for instance. So adobe structures are way more better than isolating heat than concrete structures. So once you put a concrete house down in a desert area, those houses get unbearably hot in the summer because the concrete works as a buffer of heat. And in the winter, it can get really cold outside. They're way too cold. Traditional adobe walls are very good in isolating heat and cold and are almost a natural form of air conditioning. And environmentally totally sustainable because you don't need heating, you don't need air conditioning. So I think we also can learn a lot from how people historically have been able to cope with scarcity. I could talk for hours about traditional.
Well, you wrote a whole book on it with 22 myths, and I think you probably had more myths in you, right?
No, I could talk for long also about traditional water harvesting techniques that are completely sustainable in arid areas. But so there's much we also can learn from, I think, traditional approaches of coping with scarcity, coping with extreme weather events. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. It is not, again, a cause to reason away problems and to say climate change is not an issue because it's going to create huge damage. But at the same time, it should not dismiss governments of their responsibility to protect the weak and the vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think you've been doing a lot to hold governments around the world accountable. So I will move the floor. I think we do have some questions. But as the director of the Center for Refugee Studies, I will be in trouble if I don't advertise our summer course, which is on climate migration futures. And we are doing a discount right now, 50% off virtual participation. So I put the link in the chat, so please check it out if you can. We do have a question now. Zahar, did you want to unmute and ask? And please, other people, if you have questions, Dr. Tehas would like to hear from you. So. Is it possible, Francesco, can they unmute? Yeah, I can see that.
I think let's just read out the question for now, and if Zara wants to
So
come.
I'll just read the question for now, which is a good one. Of course, they thank you. And the question is, what is the role of the private sector, such as companies, investors, on this issue?
I think, of course, the private sector can play a huge role, but I think it's really up to governments to put the right incentives in place. I mean, I'm from the Netherlands. Dutch, water engineering is huge, obviously, and because the Dutch have traditionally fought against the sea, and we as
And
Dutch
won, right?
I talk now I sound very nationalistic, but of course it shows that the human sort of resilience is huge to cope with challenges, but private sector is not going to do it on its own, unless governments stimulate, of course, the development of new techniques. And we've known, I mean, Mazzucato has published extensively about the central role governments have had, over the last 2 centuries in terms of providing the basis for fundamental research, because the private sector will never fund the fundamental research that is needed to develop new approaches, whether, from a social science or a scientific component perspective, to develop new ways of coping with such challenges. But of course, governments can provide incentives. So yeah, the private sector, I think, has always played a key role in this, and but governments really cannot, and coming back to that issue, have to provide the right incentives for the private sector to play indeed that role. So that can be in the form of direct subsidies, or indeed price incentive structures that encourage, of course, the private sector to play that role. So I think the private sector can have a huge role, but that should be in tandem with governments. I think, and this is what any sensible approach would be in this. So I think, in a way, the argument I was making about, we need to repoliticize our view on climate change and displacement is indeed exactly a call for governments to play that crucial role in providing a positive environment for business to play that role. So I see this really going into tandem, not as two opposed forces or anything like that.
We have another question. Yes, can they?
Is there any question? I don't see. I actually have a question, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that presentation. It was very, very interesting, and inspired me to go read all your articles and your books, which I will do. I actually have a question about, let's see, you ended your presentation with saying that language is not innocent. And sometimes issues such as migration or climate related, any sort of issues that we see today is very complex. So how can we shape this narrative in a way that it doesn't fully dismiss the impact of climate change, but at the same time does not give it the current pedestal that we are giving it? Because in my experience, which is not as vast as yours yet,
Yes.
I find that it's very hard to explain complexity to people who are not studying it on a day-to-day basis. They want simpler stories. So how can we design a story that does justice to the complexity of the issue, but at the same time not oversimplify it?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I think part of it is almost talking myself out of business as a migration scholar, because I actually don't think migration is as important as we often think it is. And if you allow me to start with my last point, yeah, climate change, including any form of environmental stress or any form of deprivation, for that matter, is a huge issue, but it's primarily about non-mobility. I think we have to reverse our perspective on migration. Of course, some people do flee for acute crises and things like that, but by and large, the vast majority of people in the world migrate to improve their long-term livelihoods. It's a quite planned event that required resources. Immobility is the main issue, and I think that is not very difficult to explain. I think the big risk of migration researchers tapping into the mass climate refugee narrative is falling into the exact same apocalyptic pitfall as the far right is doing. Because what I find interesting is that in both of the extremes of the spectrum, people fall into apocalyptic thinking, right? You know what the far right is saying about migrations: bring our civilization down, hordes of these people coming for all sorts of reasons, we can't use them, they're criminals, to bring down our civilization. It's about numbers and threats. But unfortunately, I have to observe that on the extreme end of the climate displacement spectrum, people tap into similar imageries. And this is why I find the push-pull model such a harmful form of pseudo theory. And I really want to eradicate it root and branch, because I'm writing a paper on this right now. It's kind of an assault on the push-pull model, because I think as long as we keep on tapping into that kind of terminology, we're lost. And I don't think it is that complex to explain that the biggest victims of climate change in this case are those people who get trapped, who literally cannot move out. And if they have to move out, they're lost with any resources. They may become homeless or lose their lives indeed, or being very adversely affected in other ways. This is not about massive cross-border migration. This is about people losing everything, and this is about protecting people. And this is also about holding governments accountable. And I know also when I talk to people in Morocco, or I've lived for years in Morocco or here in Senegal, people are also upset with their own governments to say, well, you cannot get away with a simplistic story about this is all about climate change caused by Western countries. It is also about local. Oh, that's correct, that the West has most responsibility in causing global warming, but it is not an excuse for displacing people or not being worried about people suffering from the adverse consequences of climate change and not taking any actions to mitigate that. So, and it's primarily about people not being able to move. So in a way, we have to reverse our normal way of talking about migration in crisis context. That it's not migration that's the main problem. The biggest victims of any form of adversity, including climate adversity, are those who cannot move out, who cannot use mobility as a resource to increase their resilience. And I don't think that's very difficult to explain. It does mean a paradigm shift, and that is always hard because people have to unlearn their old ways of thinking. But I actually don't think it's difficult to explain at all. It's just that we need a paradigm shift, quite radical, and that's why I think we need to root and branch the push-pull model.
Push and pull.
It's not a scientific way of thinking about migration.
No. And Hein, if you don't mind, do you want to talk briefly about your new project, about new narratives? Because I think like Nell's question actually gets to that. I found it quite inspirational when you were telling me about that work.
Yeah, I got a quite small but interesting grant from a charity here in the Netherlands. I'm not in the Netherlands right now, but from the Portuguese Foundation on changing the migration narrative. And this is exactly trying to mainstream almost what I just tried to say, because this is still, of course, a conversation between experts, but to find ways of finding different ways to talk about migration in a non-apocalyptic sort of way, not to deprogramatize it completely, but to find a more nuanced way of talking about migration without becoming overly complex, and also in a way trying to have this new paradigm and try to set up ways, find out ways. This is still a big question to me, how to do it, of different ways of talking about migration in the public arena. I think that is really key for the migration research community. Yeah, so this is something I hope to do more. And my book was in a way also an attempt to do that, to bring some mainstream insights, because nothing that I say in my book is new, I think, to migration researchers, but I think what has been lacking so far is a bridge towards the public debate. And this is really something I'm passionate about. And I think the time is there. I think we need to start doing this and become much more bold.
I think we'll be referring to it a lot because Canada has an election coming up on the 28th of April, and immigration is a very hot topic. So your book is hopefully going to take off here. But we do have two questions. Akinwale, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, please ask.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Thank you again for the guest speaker, and of course, missed most part of it, but I think based on what I've read about I'm happy I'm able to join. So my question is this: my name is Akinwale Ojomo Roy. Actually a visiting researcher at the Migration Project at Center for African Studies, University of Porto in Portugal. And recently, we just started a lab, and just in line with what the professor said about to make a migration conversation in a minuscule way and see how it affects people. My question, which I sent in earlier on, is how do we try to really increase the number of knowledge base in this space? Because as it were, when I look at it even as a researcher in this space for the past 15 years, I realized that tons of new knowledge is needed, and even we need more people. So how do we try to really make sure that there's a catalyst in increasing this knowledge, not only in master's program, PhD program, even in some certification program, especially for the politicians, right? So, and the deep part of the question, if I may, is how do we continue to have a conversation between researcher, policymakers, and the industry? Thank you very much.
I mean, this is an excellent question. Of course, in line with the previous question, how do we sort of break into the mainstream debate about migration? I think that is the $1 million question, right? I think it has to be I mean, there's many potential targets. I think education is key. I was just searching on the internet, push-pull on Google Images, and look what textbooks still say about migration, starting at the primary and secondary school level, including universities. I think there's a lot of rewriting to be done, because I think a lot of the socialization takes place at that phase in life, right? And it's all about push-pull and misery and people fleeing and a totally unscientific way of looking at migration. And I think it should really start at the very basic level. So this is really about teaching and how we teach children, and how many school textbooks, I've reviewed a few one, still tap into deep stereotypes, colonial stereotypes about third world misery projected on entire regions of the world, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, pushing all these people out, and these big stereotypes, right? That's still, it's not just about migration, it's about a stereotypical representation of the global South and how the world is being represented, and extension of that migration. So it's a huge task. We can only do it collectively, but I think it is by showing awareness, but also about trying to contribute, trying to, in our own countries, I've done this in the Netherlands to some degree, look at school textbooks and try to contact authors and or publishers. And this is very, you think this is not silly, it really starts at that level, because once people are in the university, their worldviews have already been shaped, and it's at that very fundamental level. Media is another thing. I think working directly with journalists, when we read a piece in the newspaper that's really wrong, contact the journalist directly. I've started doing that. And don't be aggressive in the approach. Just say, well, I read your article, it's very interesting, but, and not quite some journalists are quite welcome if you start doing that. So particularly if you target the bigger newspapers in your country or bigger international outlets, that can actually help, I think. But this is all about, like Max Weber said, the slow boring of hard boards. It's not going to happen overnight. And secondly, also look, thirdly, I would say, look at the language we're using ourselves, ridding ourselves of the terminology like push and pull and population pressure and migration pressure, waves and tides. I've also tried to tidy up my own language because I've committed those sins in the past as well. And I think this is just 3 examples. I think it's a multi-pronged approach, but it's need to be a collective effort, and being aware that we need to be in for the long haul, and the goal should be a paradigm shift in the way how we talk about migration. I think we should be very ambitious, and we should get rid of our social science habits of being too modest. We know a lot about migration. I do agree more research is always welcome, but I actually do believe that the prime goal should not be to get more data, but to get to get the knowledge out there. Whilst of course we always need more data, more research, but I think if that research and all that data keeps doesn't find its way out of the confines of the ivory tower, we're not going to get anywhere. So I really think that bridging towards bigger debates is important, and be quite assertive about, and be quite proud about what we know. And there is such a thing like a science of migration, I keep on saying, and let's get it out there.
Thank you, Hein. And do you mind staying for just a little longer? Because we do happen to have a lot of questions now.
That's fine. Go
Okay,
ahead.
perfect. And I will say that after speaking with you, I too have been contacting journalists nicely and asking them questions about where they got some sources from, or asking if it's okay to say there's a tsunami of people coming across borders.
No.
A tsunami. They use that in Globe and Mail, and it
Yeah.
has been received well. Right. So I do encourage that everybody here, if you see something in the newspaper that you don't appreciate or think it's too much or simply think it's wrong, definitely go ahead and contact a journalist. They are responsive to that.
Yeah,
So,
can I say one more thing about it? Paradigm shifts never happen gradually. It requires a lot of pushing, and there's actually research on this, how paradigm shifts happen in public debates. It requires a lot of pushing unto a certain point when it just happens rather quickly. So we should not give up doing these things, these day-to-day things, as Yvonne was just mentioning. It is really about keeping on pushing and convincing people. And I think on some topics, like, you know, that poverty doesn't, impoverishment doesn't necessarily lead to less migration, and development can lead to more migration. I think quite some journalists are more aware of this now than they would have been 10 years ago. So there is progress, and we shouldn't give up.
and there's also journalistic integrity. So if we point out something and we say there is a book, and I'm sure Hyde is very happy for you to cite him, that says something else, they kind of are responsible to look into it. Okay, so I will note the order of the questions. So Andrea, you're next. And then we have a question from Peter Pence, and who is a former director of the Center for Refugee Studies. So Peter, if you feel comfortable unmuting, that would be great. If not, I will read your question. Then we have Alice Kraft, and similar, if you've written a question, but if you want to share it live, that'd be great. Hein would love that. And then we have Simon. So we'll start with that and then we'll continue. So Andrea, please, or Andre, sorry, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrea Cortinoa, and Dr. Deas, it's a real pleasure listening to your presentation for many reasons. I have a short comment and a question. And I am a professor at the University of Toronto, teach courses on global migration and health. And I know your work fairly well because I've used it in my courses for several years. So just to clarify, I'm not a deterministic push-pull monocausal or depoliticizing kind of guy in any possible way. I'm happy. The comment is that I enjoyed the presentation because from your writing, I thought we would disagree on a lot more things that we actually do. I think we agree with virtually everything you have said. My question, I'm interested in the reaching limits and tipping points and thresholds. And I think what really concerns me is the fact that climate change has consequences, has an impact at the level of tertiary pathways, so systemic structural pathways as related to, for example, the global economic and political instability. And I see it as connected to a number of other crises that are now seen as being part of the so-called polycrisis. So you mentioned the fact that it's definitely a political issue very much related to the extreme concentration of wealth and inequities, but it is also related to depletion of natural resources, environmental devastation, loss of biodiversity, etc. So some of the points of the 9 points you have made might become a bit different when we think about this tipping point, this threshold. I'm thinking about, for example, as a simple example, of the fact that about 2 billion people depend on glacier water. And in some areas, I've worked many, many years in Latin America. In some areas of Latin America, populations are fully dependent on glacial water. Not having access to that water means not having access to water in general, not having access to food. And no matter how much innovation and creativity these people can have, that does translate into the need to move. And these are really large numbers of people. So I would like to know what you think about reaching these limits, reaching these tipping points. You just mentioned the fact that major changes happen quickly, and that might be the case with this type of crisis too. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, that's also what I wrote, I think, about the case of Bangladesh, for instance. Sedimentation so far, keeping up with erosion, basically, sea level rise. And this is, of course, no guarantee for the future. Some people have argued that increased rate of sedimentation in the case of Bangladesh is also caused by increasing forest clearance in the Himalayas, although others have said it is more related to the higher speed of elevation in the high Himalayas. So there's a whole debate I'm not really part of the debate, I'm just aware there is a debate on this. But of course, accelerated sea level rise could create a point where the sedimentation may no longer hold up with the erosion part of the story. So I do think that we need to be not sort of be too comfortable about things so far not having been as disastrous that this will give any guarantee in the future. I know less about the particular issue about glacial water, but I fully believe you that you may almost also can reach tipping point scenarios. However, about whether this will cause large-scale migration, there I become much more ambiguous, because the impacts of impoverishment on migration are very ambiguous, in the sense of, if people are deprived of local livelihood opportunities, it may obviously increase their aspirations to move as a way to improve their livelihoods, which is in general not necessarily about the uprooting of entire populations, but as we know from a lot of research, more about the movement of some family members to increase resilience of people living in origin areas. But the other point is that actually impoverishment caused by environmental factors may decrease long distance mobility. And I refer back to the research being done by several researchers in sub-Saharan Africa on the effect of droughts on mobility, where we found really interesting things. Sometimes we see an increase in short distance mobility, but in most studies I know of, at least 3 or 4, long distance mobility, even within countries, decreased because people have less resources to move. So again, here, I think the issue is not to dismiss serious issues and possible tipping points, but to not assume that this will lead to massive uprooting, first, and second, that increased vulnerability to environmental degradation may particularly hit those people who don't have the resources to move over long distances. So I think this is the kind of nuance we need. I don't think this is overly complicated to explain this, but it's exactly this kind of different mobilities, like short distance mobility go up, long distance mobility go down, where long distance mobility generally is more the kind of mobility that is an investment type of mobility that is more related to a resource and getting access to better incomes, where the short distance mobility is more the sort of crisis related mobility. And then people who have no resilience, they may be the people who indeed get into deep trouble in situ where they are. So I think this is really kind of the nuance we need. Don't think it is that difficult to explain this. And this has nothing to do with dismissing the risks, but the mobility consequences are going to be a bit more complex than the standard narrative tries to teach us.
Peter, were you able to unmute, Peter? Do you want to, or you want me to read your question? It's quite good. Okay, I think I'll read the question. Is it possible that climate change will lead to increased migration, not because those environmentally affected will be able to move, but because certain economies will suffer, and those with the capability to move will do so to get to places with better living opportunities, not in agriculture, but in service or manufacturing? And I think it's also a way for you to talk about your other great work on capabilities.
I mean, this is, of course, this was actually this question was, first of all, this is going to be primarily about internal migration, this whole question. We know that at least 4 out of 5 people who migrate within countries. And this is, of course, tying a bigger issue of rural to urban migration, which in many ways is the big migration of the last 2 centuries. So movement from rural to urban, whether this is within or across national borders, has been the sort of defining mobility of what I call the modern transformation. And it is, of course, very difficult to, what you could perhaps say, if there, this was a big debate in, also in the Foresight report, it has been mentioned, that most of the people who move from rural to urban areas in Bangladesh would have moved anyway, with or without increased flooding risk. Apart from the whole debate whether there is increased flooding risks or not, but even let's assume it is there, most people would have moved anyway, because there is already this bigger transformation going on from rural to service-based industrial livelihoods. What you could perhaps say that, you know, climate change related environmental degradation may accelerate a transition. I think that is probably a more nuanced way of getting the causality right. But to say it's the fundamental cause, I think it is probably giving too much weight to environmental factors. And here I go back to my research in Morocco and other African countries, where you see this bigger transition from people moving away from rural to urban. And of course, the aspirational changes are really there. I mean, almost any survey that has been done, surveys I was involved in, at least one of my collaborators was involved in Ethiopia and many other countries, showing that once people have been to school, they simply don't aspire an agricultural livelihood anymore. And this is really to do not just with resources, but also with aspired livelihoods, notions of the good life. And this is much bigger aspirational change happening, and this bigger transition out of agriculture towards non-agricultural based lifestyles. Yeah, I think I mentioned that in my book at some point. I had a discussion years ago with somebody working for the FAO and say, well, we need to develop rural areas to increase resilience of rural populations, so you will have less migration. But in a way, the irony is that agricultural development generally means more mechanization, less people needed on the farm, and it means actually you accelerate the entire process. Now, of course, climate change may accelerate the transition in many ways, if indeed particularly low, I mean, going back to my Moroccan case, smaller peasants are the first one to be driven out of agriculture, whether this is about water scarcity, because some big farmers or industries or tourist resorts pump up all the water, and don't have the money to invest in water-saving irrigation techniques like drip irrigation. They're the first one to be driven out of business. But many people have argued that NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, everybody talks now about, you know, the sort of narratives about this has shipped away jobs, you know, from the United States or Canada to low-wage countries. But in Mexico, many people have argued that NAFTA has accelerated the transfer from small-scale agriculture, you know, and have actually driven many smaller peasants out of business because of cheap imports from the US. This is, of course, no longer about climate change, but if you add on climate change to this and the increased incidence of crisis and scarcity, and of course, particularly smaller peasants are particularly vulnerable to that because they cannot insure their crops against crop failure. They don't have access to water saving or other techniques that could, in a way, protect you from such environmental vulnerabilities. And I think what it probably will do is accelerate this transition from rural to urban. But I think it would be quite tricky to attribute it largely to climate change.
Okay, and then we have Alice, who also typed out a question. Alice Kraft, were you able to unmute? Or I can also ask your question for you. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I've unmuted. I
Yeah,
hope
we can
I
hear
have.
you. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much to Yvonne and the CRS for putting this session on. Super interesting. And Dr. De Haas's viewpoint is much needed and really, really interesting. I definitely resonated with what I learned about the push-pull model many years ago in like British high schools, and I really wonder if that's the same with the textbooks being taught. That's like a lesson for me
Still,
to
yeah.
look into. I do sort of policy-facing research in Canada, particularly in the immigration space. And I wanted to ask you about how these conversations feed into sort of that type of research and conversations. And particularly, how do you see this conversation serving an alternative political reality, that being of governments garnering public and electoral support? And thinking about that, obviously Canada's going through an election season right now, so this is top of mind.
So the question is about how to, for us as researchers, to become more effective, or?
Yeah, and how do you sort of go about introducing this kind of paradigm shift that you've been talking about in this sort of policy-facing research space? So yeah, definitely part of that is how effective we engage with policymakers, but
Yeah.
engaging in these larger conversations to do with the paradigm shift that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a great question. If I had the answer already on it, we would already have a different conversation globally. But yeah, going back to what I said, apart from indeed us trying to step in every time we hear something outrageous, unacceptable, and where we can correct it by either contacting authors of textbooks or journalists, I think it is also indeed the kind of narrative we use as researchers. I think what I see a lot, and I don't think is particularly effective, is that quite some researchers position themselves as activists or political actors in the public debate. And in a way, then you're lost. And that happened a few times to me in the past, actually quite unwillingly, where I got onto a TV show, for instance, in the Netherlands, some debate program, where I was sitting in the studio together with some extreme right-wing politician, and then you're lost because you're automatically, even if you try to be nuanced, you're going to be seen as this open borders lunatic, and this is how it's going to be framed. So it's also about being aware how we are being framed, but also staying away from it in a way. There is a certain tendency amongst migration researchers, and again, I've done that also in the past, in using sort of moral, ethical arguments about this border policy being unacceptable, leading to unspeakable suffering. And although these things should be said, I think, because we're also citizens, I try to focus more and more on the following line of reasoning, that as long as we don't understand migration, as long as we base our understanding of the nature and cause of migration on an unscientific way of thinking of it, migration policies will keep on failing. Because migration policies fail because they're not based on a real understanding. I don't want to repeat the title of my book, but this is how my title of my book actually was born, in a way, that I say, well, migration policies keep on failing because they're not based on a real understanding of migration, how migration works. So we need a scientific understanding. Whether you're in favor of less migration, more migration, different migration, it doesn't matter. So I'm not serving a particular agenda. So if it actually has happened to me, politicians contacting me after publication of my book, actually conservative politicians contacting me, which I saw as a good thing, asking me, what can we really do to decrease migration? I said, well, given the fact that a lot of migration is driven by labor markets, labor market demand, I think Canada is a good case in point. You could, and we have created this liberal economy where we have actually decreased government controls on labor markets as part of a bigger sort of neoliberal project. Well, you should, in a way, make your economy less liberal and regulate your labor market more than you did it over the last 2 or 3 decades. I'm not saying this is what I want personally, but if you ask me honest advice, you cannot talk about migration without talking about how we organize our labor market. Now, the same for migration and development, right? We have to be honest about these things. I had left-wing politicians getting almost angry at me when I said, well, I don't think development aid to poor countries, even if it would work, would decrease migration because all the evidence shows in quite a different direction. Well, you shouldn't be undermining development aid. I said, well, I'm not here to defend development aid. I'm here to, as a scientist in a way, not to steer off my knowledge and not using the wrong, not to be right for the wrong reasons. That's exactly the way I've criticized the mass climate sort of tsunami narrative that I say, well, don't be right for the wrong reasons. So don't peddle this migration threat narrative in order to gain support for agenda, because it will ultimately undermine your story because it's not based on science. So staying quite close to the facts, I think, ultimately will enhance our credibility in the public debate. And I think that's the key issue. As soon as we start to buy into narratives that we know are actually not credible scientifically, we potentially undermine our credibility. And I think our credibility is the most important thing. So to be unpolitical in the way we frame our knowledge, I think it is quite important.
And I do want to applaud you, Hein, for speaking with the right-wing commentators and going on those television shows, because it takes a lot. And I think you do it really well. And I think more of us need to do that, even though it's scary.
I was on a TV show in the Netherlands. It's the closest equivalent of Fox News. And it was a big success because I think I completely surprised the hosts, because they thought they would get some open border left-wing lunatic. And this is not what I was saying. I said, well, but the first question they asked me, is there a migration crisis? And in the past, I would have said, no, not really, because global migration is not on an all-time high. And I just have felt it doesn't work. I said, yeah, there is a migration crisis. Look at what's happening at the border. People are dying on the border. People are suffering on the border. Migrants are being exploited. We do have real issues with segregation, but it's a political crisis. We have not been able to regulate it correctly. This is why we see all these problems. It's a political crisis because governments and politicians don't want to look at the facts, and they're not held accountable by journalists, by their constituents. And I think that is the real message. And I think this is where we can step in. So, well, we have some evidence to make this into a real debate. And this is something I learned over the last 1 or 2 years since I published my book with Penguin, and now of course different translations are coming out, and this has convinced me that we need this new way of positioning ourselves into the debate and confronting both left and right with the hard evidence that I think is uncomfortable on both sides of the debate in many ways.
And please use Hein's words against him and email him to ask him to come to Canada. I've been petitioning him, okay? But I think if he gets more emails from you guys, that will help.
I would love to come over. Yeah.
We have Simon. Simon, can you please unmute and ask your question, and then we'll move on to some of the other written questions.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed this. So I'm based at the University of Leeds in the UK. I'm the co-director for the Center for Global Development. And I'm just wondering in terms of your central message here. So we take, for example, rural communities in Zambia that are confirming, acknowledging the frequency and intensity of floods or droughts in this case, and this sort of rural to rural migration taking place from drier regions to areas where there's fertile land or favorable rainfall pattern. What is the message here for such kind of movements? And before we can link this to the wider political realities of the country, what would be your central message in such a scenario? If you can comment on that.
Well, I would say don't try to stop it. I mean, whenever governments have tried to stop these kind of things, people generally have good reasons to move. And if governments start to stop it, I mean, there is a quite widespread narrative that was very common in Europe, by the way, until the early 20th century, but it's very common in many, I've noticed this in many African countries of governments, that we somehow should stop this movement out of rural areas or indeed rural to rural migration. I think governments are inherently, I think it's a broader point that states, I think, always get nervous once people start moving spontaneously, particularly in directions government would not like to see. I always find it quite ironic that the narrative of European or Western states about we have to stop the South-North migration is often reproduced within developing countries by elites that live in urban areas, basically telling rural people not to move. And again, the underlying message is, I think it's often implicit in the narrative that this is somehow irrational. People should be sensitized, that it's not in their own interest to come either to the West or to rural areas. The example you gave about people living in environmentally vulnerable areas in Zambia, for instance, which may indeed, due to climate change, be more prone to droughts and flooding. Yeah, if people move away from those areas, they probably have good reasons to do it. So governments could do two things. I mean, they could, of course, try to prevent it, but the only way to do it is to increase resiliency of local populations, or if indeed people have no real choice but to leave, to create better circumstances there where they go to. I think that's also been most of the outcome of the literature on urbanization in the so-called global south, that basically you can't stop it. And the more governments try to stop it, the more misery it actually produces of people living in urban areas. So governments should accommodate this in a way. It is again the difficulties of governments, whether you talk about international migration or domestic migration, about governments to come to terms with reality. And the longer governments wait with this, the more problems it's going to create, particularly suffering and marginalization of migrants, whether this is within countries or across international borders. So I think the message is really accept the reality, don't fight against it, and try to accommodate. Migration is rarely ever about the massive uprooting of entire populations. It's a over time quite gradual process. And if governments have this year-to-year approach of accommodating these things are manageable. And as we know about international migration, migrants don't destroy economies, they increase the size of economies. That's the same for urban economies. And if governments accommodate it and make sure that migrants can find a legal place and a safe place to live in, then the effects can be quite positive. But of course, if governments deny the reality, we get all these problems we talk about. Whether you talk about people living in slum areas that don't have basic facilities, or whether migrants live in segregated places in destination countries. So it's the basic lack of accepting migration as a fact of life, as a normal process, I think, that is underlying most problematic governmental approaches to migration. And again, it's stepping into this narrative about mass displacement that is paralyzing debates. So I think the more people also, going back to the topic of this seminar, of course, climate change is going to pose challenges for mobile and immobile people. But the problem with the push-pull is this imagery, and this neo-Malthusianism is this imagery of the mass movement, the huge waves, and this is generally not how it happens. And I think that is also another reason to steer away and to stay away from this kind of language, because it perpetuates also a political fear of the tsunami coming in once we try to acknowledge this reality.
Okay, we've got a question from Shamarki. Do you want to unmute? Oh, yep. Great. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yes, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on how fragile state could manage migration, as we know that they don't have the capacity to manage, and how do you see the responsibility of states, particularly when fragile state lacks the capacity to effectively manage migration? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, great question. I wouldn't call the US a fragile state. I think the problem, I'll get into the fragile state issue later, but I think the United States has a basic political unwillingness to acknowledge the reality of migration, which in the US, by the way, has more to do with the lack of acknowledgement that the US has huge labor demand for lower skilled workers, not enough legal channels for those people to come in. And this is the main reason why we have 12 million undocumented migrants in the United States. And we know from very good research done by Douglas Massey and others in the United States that misguided border closures actually have accelerated the permanent settlement of those undocumented populations, because people no longer could go back and forth. So this is in a nutshell why the US is in this huge immigration conundrum, and what you now see on television is largely symbolic things that the Trump government is using to create this image of being tough, but nothing is being done on the real drivers of immigration to the US, which is still very much labor market driven. Now, as I've kind of joked in my book that, you know, since labor demand is the main driver of migration, globally speaking, and certainly in the US, the best way to really bring down migration is to wreck your economy. So if the Trump government is indeed wrecking the economy, then migration to the US will go down, but it has more to do with growing unemployment, lower labor demand in the US, and any other factor, although I'm sure the US government will attribute everything to the border management, even though migration researchers know things are different. But this is how politicians spin things all the time, right? To go back to the broader issues, how do fragile states, I mean, even strong states, I mean, another one-liner I can dish out here is only totalitarian governments are able to totally control immigration. I mean, this goes back to the basic liberal paradox that, you know, this idea that if you have this open market economy with borders that are pretty open to movement of capital, information, business, goods, then it's actually impossible to also totally control migration, to totally control cross-border traffic. I mean, I was just on a small boat tour here in Saint Louis and actually was in Mauritania at some point. I didn't see Frontex. And talking to a lot of young people here, they still find ways to the Canary Islands. And they have been doing that for the last 20 years. Every migration researcher who's worked on the ground, particularly those smuggling researchers, just knows that migrants will always know a way to cross borders if there's a good reason to cross borders. That could, of course, be political violence or disasters, but still in most cases had more to do with livelihoods and work opportunities than anything else. So I think if the goal for government is to totally control what's happening on the border, it's a lost cause, unless you're a totalitarian state. So and I think that's a little bit wrong with the main tagline also of, you know, IOM, right? Orderly migration. Well, migration does make state nervous because many people move spontaneously. And if they can't do it within the law, they do it outside of the law. And if governments design immigration systems that are totally a mismatch with the reality of migration, then people will find other ways to migrating. So I think the only way to have a real working migration system is not just to talk about migration, but also talk about very different issues about, you know, social security, how you organize your labor market, to what extent you want certain sectors to be entirely dependent on a cheap migrant workforce or not. But as long as governments tolerate these things, basically, migration will never stop. And of course, that migration will totally stop is a complete illusion for any wealthy open market economy. But of course, you could regulate it better by creating a better match between how you organize your labor markets and your immigration system. So I think many countries are in a total state of denial. I mean, the little I know of for instance, migration in Southern Africa is that a country like South Africa is also in complete denial with their approaches towards labor migrants coming in from countries like Zimbabwe and other countries in Southern Africa. That, yeah, the South African economy is also to a large degree depending on migrant labor, particularly in those jobs that many South Africans don't want to work. So it's the same scenario reproducing itself. So I think it is very much about the denial of reality and this illusion of total control that will always make a migration policy fail. It's a very difficult question. I don't have a simple answer, but I hope it gives some ideas.
Hey, Hein, we're going to continue for 10 more minutes, but I did want to say that I think you're the only academic where we can probably successfully sell merch with. Okay, so we're going to put your one-liners on t-shirts when you come to Canada, kind of a merch table on it. That's how we're going to fight back with different narratives.
Baseball caps.
So the next question is from our colleague, Amanda Alikar. It's a really interesting question. It's regarding the role of media and representing climate and migration. Are there any studies that assess the impact of media on public opinion regarding this issue? Additionally, what are your thoughts on how far-right parties reconcile their skepticism towards climate science with their portrayal of climate migrants as threats to national identity and social cohesion?
Well, to start with the latter question, they wouldn't frame those migrants as climate migrants. And I was, when I put my blog, before I wrote this book chapter on climate migration, I had a blog, and I saw that some far-right people were abusing my argument to say, you see, climate change is not creating migration. This is why I have this huge preamble in my book chapter, like climate change is real and it's a huge problem. So to make sure, you know,
Right.
to start the chapter with that. So I also made me aware, you need to be very self-conscious about how things can be used out of context. So you have to be quite careful how you present those arguments. Well, I think it's a problem with the issue I was raising earlier. One of the discoveries I made doing background research for my book is that on both extremes, actually, we often say extremes meet, right? And certainly on migration narratives, the extreme left and the extreme right tend to meet each other, because I think some environmentalists more on the extreme side tend to buy into apocalyptic stories, doomsday scenarios about climate change. I understand why this is happening, so it's not that I have not any empathetic sort of understanding why people do that, or why organizations who want to get more funding or attention from media are doing that, but I think it is a dangerous game, because you in a way play the same game as the extreme right wing, although the alleged causes of this invasion is different. So let's say on the left, the more extreme side of the left-wing sort of narrative, it's either third world poverty or climate change or a combination thereof that leads to mass displacement. And this is why we see people drowning on European borders kind of narrative, or caravans, you know, these kind of images. On the extreme right, it's not less that, although people wouldn't necessarily deny that stereotypical third world poverty plays a role. I have to think about Trump's shithole country narrative. But their reaction will be, well, that's their own problem. It's created by their own mismanagement, you know, lack of civilization, you know, all these narratives, right? And we can't accommodate all those people here anyway, so we have to shut the border. But the underlying deep idea of the nature of migration being increasingly massive, this massive exodus from the global south to the global north, and the causes being somehow linked to stereotypical third world poverty, whatever the cause, you know, whether it's on the extreme right wing, the sort of civilizational problem, or you know, inferior culture, or whether it's third world poverty caused by colonialism, post-colonialism, unequal trade, climate change. The fundamental issue, the analysis is the same. This poverty is pushing people out, and this is creating us problems at the border, and the reaction may be different, right? On the left, you hear more often, oh, we need to make sure global inequality decreases, we need to fight climate change. I'm all in favor of that, but I wouldn't make the argument that will then lead to less migration, which was not as massive in the first place as those narratives seem to suggest. And we're actually more driven by opportunities in Western countries like jobs than anything else. So I think we need to stay clear of all these discourses in the first place. I think that is the clear cut we need to make. And this is what I mean with the paradigm shift we need. We need to really stay clear of it and start to tap into a very different narrative. Yeah, and how to be more effective, I think it was the first part of the question. Yeah, any sort of media, of course. And I think, yeah, perhaps one-liners can help, or being quite crisp and clear and trying to be quite assertive, or to say, well, if you're really interested in to say something else, I don't think it is morally reprehensible if you are in favor of less immigration, as long as you don't tie it to racist, xenophobic discourse. I think in some ways a reasonable argument can be made. If I would ask my personal opinion, for instance, I don't think it's a good thing if you create entire sectors that are being dependent on the exploitation of migrant laborers. There's good reasons to rethink how we organize transport business, the care business, particularly elderly care, the whole, you know, food chain, you know, from picking of vegetables to slaughtering of animals to preparing and delivering food, how dependent it has become on a totally exploited migrant workforce, to give just two examples. And there is also a lot of evidence to show that this is mainly already better off that benefit from that. And although migrants don't take away jobs, lower skilled native workers certainly don't benefit from it. So from their perspective, there's a good reason to ask, well, what's in it for me, right? So we can also be more critical towards sort of pro-migration, very corporate narrative. So there's nothing morally imprehensible with the idea. Perhaps we need a bit more slowing down of immigration, or perhaps the whole assumption that there will always be people ready to come. If you look at global demographic change, I think, yeah, there's reason to be more critical, but then the response should be different, you know? We should more look at how we organize our societies and economies if we want any change in migration reality. So I think there could be a lot of soul searching to be done also in the sort of pro-migration camp. And that's another reason why I think migration researchers should stay clear of positioning themselves to being pro or anti-migration, because as I say in my book, it's a totally silly way, of course, having a real debate about migration, because being pro or anti-migration would be like being pro or anti the economy or education.
No, but Hein, I think if you're interested, there is probably a lot of room for you to talk about that now, you know, perhaps the Globe and Mail or something, because I think a lot of Canadians are reconciling with that. For the first time in a quarter century, we have more Canadians saying that immigration is bad. And there's so much branding about Canada and immigration that we can't have this conversation because of this polarization. So
we need
so
to
many
overcome
people
it.
fall into what you're describing in between, wrestling with the moral ideas of how to even think about immigrants. Their neighbors are immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I interact with people that now ID me as an immigrant and have a hard time talking about it. And I think the media has forced this on them, right? But they don't have the tools. They don't have the words to think this through because we've always just been pro or anti, and there's nothing in between.
And I think once you say that to people, people get it. So it's another thing I would say. One of the main problem with, the main scientific problem with migration is the push-pull model, which I think is a pseudo theory, which actually neither logically nor empirically passes the test of a real theory in the first place. So we need a paradigm shift scientifically. Part of that narrative is spilling over in the public narrative, the push-pull language. But I think if you look at the public debate, it's the polarization.
Mm-hmm.
I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal of all newspaper outlets in the US, where I tried to argue that we will never solve this problem in the US unless we recognize the reality and overcome. But the debate in the US is so polarized that it's very difficult to run a nuanced argument because but I think it's the only way forward, to be honest. But when you say to people in a debate, this pro-anti framing is totally silly, because have you ever asked have you ever heard a journalist asking a politician whether she or he is against or in favor of the economy? People start laughing. They think, yeah, this is indeed silly. We need to have a different debate about migration. So I think it's really about using these kind of arguments, going back to the question of Nilanjan, I think, about how we do it. It doesn't have to be so complicated. We just have to find narrative strategies of breaking this one line. I was just saying how silly it is to be pro-anti. Actually, once you say it, the penny drops and people say, yeah, this is indeed silly. This is crazy, you know. And most people have ambiguous feelings about migration, and it's not about pro or anti. And I think then you're already one huge step further to have a real debate.
Yeah. Okay, we have two last questions. One from Devin Manu. Could you unmute? And then we'll get to Aman next, and then we'll wrap it up, because thank you so much, Hein, for your time.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I was wondering actually about a recent article which I was reading in the Times, which said that in this era of divisive politics, particularly progressive politics, how it's declining in Europe as well as in the US, Denmark's model of tighter immigration policies, how that has been an alternative. And the model of Denmark, from what I understand, there is tighter immigration policies, but then there is also an avenue for social assimilation of the immigrants who enters the system. So my question for you would be, in Europe and in the US, where there has been a populist backlash against immigrants, how would you evaluate Denmark's model in terms of providing an alternative? Once again, I realize it's not a question particularly on the climate aspect of it, but rather on the migration policy. Thank you.
I'm also happy not only talk about climate migration. And that's the whole point. Climate plays a role, but we need to talk about migration much more comprehensively. First of all, Denmark has migration levels that are roughly equal to most Western European countries. So there's this bit myth being spun. This whole debate in Western Europe, including the Netherlands, particularly in the Netherlands, Benelux countries and Scandinavia, is all about asylum. It's not really about the bigger picture of migration. Asylum, depending on the countries, perhaps 10 to 15% of total immigration. the big increase in migration to most Western European countries has about the growing labor shortages because of demographic change and labor market changes. Asylum has totally dominated migration debate to the point that many people in Northwestern Europe think that asylum seekers are the biggest migrant group. So Denmark has opted out of the sort of EU framework on asylum migration, where they could basically apply more stringent asylum policies. And on a Danish level, it seemed to have worked, but it basically led to the reverse waterbed effect, as I call it, that basically asylum seekers that in the past would go to Denmark now go to the Netherlands or Germany. So on a short-term national level, it seemed to have worked for asylum seekers. But of course, on a European level, it hasn't solved any issues. But the biggest thing is that asylum of overall migration levels to Denmark are not lower than to most other Western European countries. So we have to see this in a broader context. So the Danish solution is being used by the extreme right in European countries, and the same for Orban's policies, for instance, Hungary's policies. But the irony in a way is that because Orban and Hungary is so hostile towards asylum seekers, they to say it unceremoniously, they dump the problems on other countries, neighboring countries. So it is not really solving any bigger issue. And I think it is also, again, part of the overall narrative that tries to draw the attention away from the fact that non-asylum migration is by far the most important source of migration to Western countries. And that is really the issue that the far right is not wanting to touch, is that you know, I've run this argument earlier. I say the biggest increase in migration, and also particularly legal migration, has been about lower skilled labor demand. It is not accommodated through legal migration policies, and a huge willingness of Western governments to turn a blind eye towards the illegal deployment of migrant workers, and also the exploitation of legal migrant workers. I mean, in my book, there is this one statistic that the number of employers that gets criminally prosecuted in the United States for employing undocumented workers is somewhere in the range of between 15 and 20 per year, which is absolutely symbolic. So it shows the hollowness of the narrative, you know, and what we see on television. You know, don't think Trump has deported more migrants last month than in previous years. Migrants are being deported, but it just hits the headlines much more, and it's absolutely symbolic compared to the broader issue. So it's a huge distraction away from the real issue. So I'm turning in circles, I realize. So I'm going back to these bigger picture issues of, you know, labor demand and the political hypocrisy around migration. And unless we come to terms with the reality, I think we cannot have a real debate about migration.
Okay, we have a final question. Aman? Great. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor, for the very interesting talk. My name is Iman Ahmed. My background is public health and also migration and refugee studies. I've got 2 points and would love to hear your reflections.
Yes.
The first point is that migration, in my opinion, has happened for centuries. It continues to happen.
Can you give me 5 seconds? I just need to open a door.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because I didn't know it would go so long.
Sorry.
Just 1 minute, no worries.
Thanks for sticking it through, everyone. 35 of you are still here. That's amazing. And I posted a lot of links in the chat for the various things that he mentioned, including the aspirations capabilities framework, the Dutch interview, and then the Wall Street Journal. And again, please come to the summer course. Even though Hein does not like climate migration, please come. We agree to disagree. He's gonna watch this recording and be like, I didn't agree for you to say that.
Sorry, I'm back again.
Perfect.
No problem. Thank you, Professor. So my first point is, would love to hear your reflection on how can we drive the narratives or discussion towards more acknowledging that migration as a phenomenon is normal rather than problematizing it. And my second point is, and that's as scholars, not as advocates and activists or like in a hyped up fashion or antagonistic way. My second point is regarding quote unquote labor migration and looking at a country like my home country, current home. I'm from Sudan, I'm Canadian, and Canada's way of inviting more labor migrants. I'm a public health practitioner. During COVID-19, we have seen how labor migrants have been heavily impacted by the pandemic, and that's because of the lack of safeguards and ambiguous situations, loss of health insurance, and so on. And that's around the world. What I'm seeing is a similar pattern to the push and pull, but it's more of a labor-driven from a country like Canada. And now African countries are competing to provide labor without much safeguards. And either the push or pull is, in my opinion, taking away the agency of the labor migrants themselves, if we agree to call them labor migrants. And I see it as a modern day form of slavery. So would like to hear your reflection. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. I mean, again, this is a huge question.
You deal with huge questions, so this is why it's up to you.
Yeah, a great question as well. I think this labor thing is really crucial. I think it really gets snowed under in the entire narrative. I mean, actually growing increasingly, it's this push perspective that has become dominant, right? Particularly when the narratives about South-North migration, which is a problematic term in itself, because we know that many people move, within countries and between countries of roughly equal levels of development. But yeah, if we talk indeed about these movements towards the so-called global north, it's very much framed as this poverty push. But the reality, and that's what everybody knows, you were just referring to it, in the middle of COVID, there was a temporary reappreciation of those vulnerable workers because everybody saw, oh, how essential they suddenly were, right? It's exactly those jobs where people need to show up that are often done by migrants. And these were, of course, like you were, I think, referring to also the people in the case of COVID, but I think more generally are most vulnerable in terms of health and exploitation and things like that. And whatever way we call it, I think modern slavery, my problem with that is it takes totally away the agency. And I'm a bit wary myself of using the slavery label to equate the plight of exploited labor migrants with the plight of people who were actually enslaved from Africa to the Americas. So that's why I have some hesitation about using those sensationalist labels. But I get your point. I think it is the complete hypocrisy in a way in the global north, in the migration narrative, because the official narrative is the good and the bad migrant, and the good migrant is the highly skilled migrant. But we know that even skilled migrants get hugely exploited. Yeah, also in the European context, we see that doctors from Africa, for instance, are being exploited in the labor market, provide similar service for lower salaries with very insecure residency provisions, for instance. Lack of recognition of diplomas. I mean, we all know the problems. And but of course, for lower skilled migrants, it's even worse. It's a total non-acknowledgement of those population groups providing absolutely essential labor. And I think that is where the real issue is. It's about class, basically. It's portraying the lower skilled migrants as the unwanted migrant. And from that perspective, anti-immigration narratives and what we right now see in the US is not so much meant to stop migration. The prime result is that migrants get even more terrified. They're even less likely to seek help or legal advice if they get exploited or are treated unfairly. So it makes them easier to exploit. Nobody in the United States is seriously believing that one day all the 11 or 12 million undocumented migrants will be deported. It's not really about that. I mean, I remember Douglas Massey famously arguing that the prime objective of immigration politics is to create the impression of being in control. And I was just referring to that very low enforcement rate, even in a country like the US, showing that People don't want big brother involvement in their hiring and firing practices, and everybody knows that. It's the same in the UK, it's the same in most Western European countries. So I think it's just political hypocrisy around the actual need for that lower skilled labor, but that then framing those same labor migrants as the unwanted migrants, I think, which is the real conundrum in the debate right now. And we need to get out there, and I think we need to come in there to make those very fundamental points. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Hein. I mean, if you guys can unmute, you guys can all clap, but this was absolutely wonderful. And I think we all learned so much. And thank you for all you continue to do. Because I mean, writing this book was a huge undertaking, and getting it translated and doing these talks and making sure the word gets out there. It's a thankless job. So thank you for everything you do. And we're excited for your new projects, new narratives. And Canada is a country that needs these conversations. It's going to be a very intense 30 days of election campaigning. So if you feel free to voice some opinions, give us some advice and lessons of how to have these conversations as a country, as it will definitely be a hot topic.
Well, good luck, and I would say please chip into the debate. Try to to be that moderating voice. But I know it's difficult, but I think yeah, I think the time is there. I think to really start more. Like I was saying in the beginning, thanks for the opportunity in the first place, and thanks for the great questions. But I think it's high time that we really get into the debate more assertively. I don't mean aggressively, but more with more self-confidence, and making those very fundamental points. I think I really hope this seminar contributed to this again, and this whole debate I think was extremely useful. So thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you, and look forward to welcoming you to Canada.
Thank
Same
you.
here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care.